So the things we've been looking at so far have been focused on autistic differences and also thinking a lot about the language that is used to refer to autistic people. And we've looked at how different autistic people can be. Sometimes that can be something that people find confusing. How can people who are so very different all have the same diagnosis? George, is there anything we can do that would help people to understand that, do you think?
Yeah, so this is an area that people often find really difficult to understand. You can have people who are just so incredibly different with the same diagnosis, and that just doesn't make sense to people. So one way I try to explain this is by using an analogy based on cake, because who doesn't love cake, right? So in order to make a cake, you need certain core ingredients. And depending on the way those ingredients are mixed, you can get different types of cakes. And I think it's the same when someone receives an autism diagnosis. You need to have those core ingredients, and they might be slightly different types of ingredients, but they're still those same core aspects which define what we define as an autistic person. Now, the way that we combine those and the other things that we can put into that mix create really different types of cake. And so you could say really different types of autistic people. We also know that most autistic people will have other co-occurring conditions. And so you could see those are different ingredients going into that cake. And there's often a misconception that the autism spectrum is linear, ranging from people who are just a little bit autistic to people who are really autistic. But the spectrum simply doesn't work like that. It's about the different combination of those ingredients. So you could describe one cake as having more sugar or another cake as using more flour. And depending on the proportions of those same ingredients, it's going to create a very different sort of cake. And then when we bring in other conditions, those could be different sorts of toppings or sprinkles or flavorings that we can add to create very different types of cake. And I think it's also important to look at those in terms of different support needs. So people who have more needs in one particular area, more of one ingredient, will have different support needs, and again look very different from other types of autistic people, but they're equally autistic, even if they have more support needs in certain areas. Because sometimes people like to say things like, oh, we're all a little bit autistic, we're all on the spectrum somewhere. And we're really not. That's a bit like saying, well, because a quiche has eggs in it, it's a little bit cake. And a quiche very clearly isn't a little bit cake. And where we say that about autistic people, we need to understand that autistic people can be hugely different, but it doesn't make sense to say a Battenberg is more cakey than a Victoria sponge. And it can be confusing people. There are sort of lots of conditions which overlap and have some of those same ingredients. So I think ADHD is a really good example, which shares many of the ingredients that you might have in a cake. So you could say ADHD are like biscuits because they've got many of those same ingredients. And there are people who have many conditions at the same time. So it is confusing, but hopefully that analogy helps explain why autistic people can be so different and yet have the same diagnosis.
I think that's really helpful. Thank you, George. And some of those issues are things that we'll return to throughout the course. In terms of the next topic, we're going to be looking in more detail about diagnostic criteria and thinking about and reflecting on that, and also thinking about issues around access to diagnosis and whether everybody has the same opportunities to seek diagnosis if that's what they want to do, or whether there are inequalities around being able to access a diagnostic assessment.